My wife had been gone almost 2 years when the call came that my brother was dying. I drove 11 hours straight from Tucson to a hospice in Boise, the kind of place that smells like lavender trying to cover something else. The nurse at the front desk gave me a look I couldn't read and said my brother had been asking for me. Across from his room, a woman in a wheelchair with a quilt over her knees watched me walk past. She didn't say anything that first day. On the fourth night, a little after 2 in the morning, I stepped out to get coffee from the machine down the hall. Her room was dark except for the hallway light cutting across the floor. She was sitting right in the doorway like she'd been waiting for me. She looked up and said very soft, almost like she was afraid somebody would hear. "Whatever your nephew tells you when he gets here, don't believe a word of it. Drive home tonight if you can. My name is Owen Hartwich. I'm 63 years old. I worked 38 years as a freight dispatcher for a regional trucking company before I retired 3 summers ago. I've always thought of myself as a careful man. I balance my checkbook every Sunday morning. I read the fine print. My wife Marlo used to laugh because I could spend 20 minutes at a gas pump deciding whether the car wash was worth the extra $4. I tell you that so you understand the man I was when I walked into that hospice. The man who looked at the woman across the hall and thought she was probably confused, or medicated, or lonely, or just working something out from her own life and dropping it onto mine. The man who hugged his nephew the next day and nearly signed away his brother's last wishes because he wanted to believe blood still meant what it used to mean. Some details of this story have been changed for storytelling. The heart of it hasn't. My brother's name was Hollis. He was 4 years older than me, and after our father walked out in the spring of 1968, Hollis raised me more than anybody else did. He was 12 and I was 8, and from then on he was the one who taught me how to throw a curveball, how to shave without carving my face up, how to apologize when I'd been stupid. He was the steadiest man I ever knew. So when his daughter-in-law called me late in October and said he'd been moved into hospice care, I didn't even pack properly. I threw 3 shirts and a toothbrush into a duffel bag, got in my truck and started driving. Hollis had pancreatic cancer. By the time I got there, he was maybe 90 pounds. His hands shook when he tried to hold the cup of ice chips the nurse brought in, but his mind was still there. Sharp. The first thing he did when I leaned over the bed was grab my wrist and pull me close and say, "Where's the boy? Where's Cale? You seen him yet?" Cale was his only son, 41 years old, lived up near Spokane, worked in commercial insurance or something close to it. I told Hollis no, I hadn't seen him yet, that the nurse said he'd be down in the morning. Hollis nodded, but he didn't look relieved. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I sat with him for 3 days before the woman across the hall spoke more than 2 words to me. I learned from one of the nurses that her name was Mrs. Pebbly. Late 70s, maybe 80. Stage for something. I never asked what. She had a daughter who came once on Sunday afternoon with a paper bag of clean nightgowns and left 20 minutes later. Other than that, nobody. The first day I passed her room, I said hello. She nodded. The second day, I brought her one of the muffins from the little family kitchen the volunteers kept stocked. She took it and said, "Thank you," in a very proper way, and that was all. The third night, close to midnight, I stepped out of Hollis's room to walk a little because the air in there felt thick with machines and waiting. Mrs. Pebbly was awake, sitting up under a low lamp, doing a crossword in pen. She looked at me and said, "Your brother's dying. Not cruelly. Not dramatically. Just stating a fact." I said, "Yes, ma'am. He is." She said, "He's worried about something. He talks in his sleep. Nurses come and go and they don't listen. I can hear through the wall." I remember I gave a little tired smile and said something polite, something about her keeping him company in her own way. I didn't think much of it. People talk in their sleep, especially people on morphine. Then the next night came. It was after 2. I hadn't slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in days. The night nurse had asked me to step out so she could change Hollis's line. I was heading toward the coffee machine when I saw Mrs. Pebbly sitting in her wheelchair in the dark doorway of her room, not moving, just watching the hall. She lifted one finger at me. That kind of small motion that means come here and don't make noise. "I walked over," she said. "Sit down a minute." I pulled the visitor chair over and sat. She had pale gray eyes, very clear, and she studied me a long time before she spoke. "Your nephew gets in tomorrow," she said. I said yes. She said, "Your brother told a nurse last night when he was half out of himself. Said the boy was coming and he was afraid of what the boy was going to do. He said he should have changed the will. He said it 3 times. Nurse patted his hand and moved on. I heard him. I felt something cold move down my back. I asked her what exactly she meant. She said, "I had a son once. He's why I'm in here alone. Whatever your nephew tells you tomorrow, don't believe a word of it. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. Drive home tonight if you can." I mean it. I thanked her. I told her I appreciated her concern. Then I went back into my brother's room, sat in the dark beside his bed, and told myself she was a sad old woman with a family wound that had never healed, and now she was seeing it everywhere. That was my first mistake. Cale showed up around 11 the next morning in a charcoal jacket with no tie. Hair gone a little silver at the temples, smelling like aftershave and airport coffee. He came through the door, hugged me before he even looked at his father, and said, "Uncle, I'm so sorry. I got here as fast as I could." He held that hug a beat longer than felt natural. I noticed it, and I dismissed it. He sat by Hollis's bed, said all the right things in all the right tones, took his father's hand, asked if he was comfortable, told the nurse thank you. Hollis was awake, barely. At one point he turned his head, looked at me, then looked at Cale, and his eyes filled up. He opened his mouth like he was about to say something to me. Then he closed it again. I still see that. An hour later Cale said, "Uncle, can we step out and talk about arrangements?" About after. We went down to the cafeteria. He bought us both coffee, sat across from me, laid his hands flat on the table like a man about to conduct reasonable business, and said, "Dad's been worrying about the house. The cabin in Coeur d'Alene. That cabin mattered." Hollis had built most of it with his own hands in the late 70s on a piece of lakefront property he'd bought for next to nothing. By then it had to be worth $700,000, maybe more. He'd lived there alone since Patricia died in 2015. Cale said, "He wants me to handle the transfer. The doctor told me this morning he probably won't make it through the week. Maybe not the next 48 hours. If we don't get this signed while he's still lucid, it goes into probate, and it turns into a 2-year mess that eats itself alive in legal fees." That was plausible enough to sound wise if you were tired and grieving and wanted somebody else to take the wheel. I nodded slowly. He went on. "Dad asked me before I flew out the first time to draft up a quick claim deed, just to keep things clean. He wants the cabin signed over to me directly so I can deal with final expenses, maybe sell it if I need to, and whatever's left stays in the family. But he can barely hold a pen now. We're going to need a notary, and we're going to need a witness." Then he looked at me like it was the most natural thing in the world. "That's where you come in." I asked, "What about your sister?" Cale had a sister, my niece, Bri. Lived in Oregon. Taught at a community college. 2 kids. She and Cale had never been especially close. He said, "Bri's not in the will for the cabin. Mom and Dad set that up years ago. Cabin comes to me. She got the life insurance and the savings. This is just paperwork. That ought to have settled me." It almost did. Then I heard Mrs. Pebbly in my head again. "Don't sign anything." I said, "I'd like to see what your father had drawn up before." Cale smiled, but only with his mouth. "Of course, Uncle. I've got it in my bag upstairs. But honestly, I hate to put you through reading legal language in the middle of all this. You're grieving. Let me handle it. You just sign as witness when the notary comes this afternoon." I said, "I'd still like to see it." That was when I saw it. Just for a second. A small shift in his face. The smile stayed put, but something behind his eyes closed like a door. Then he said, "Sure. Whatever makes you comfortable." I went back upstairs with my coffee getting cold in my hand. Hollis was asleep. I sat beside him and looked at his face and thought about all the times that man had stepped in for me without hesitation. I thought about the woman across the hall. I thought about Cale's expression when I asked for the paperwork. At 4 that afternoon, a man in a brown suit came down the hall carrying a leather briefcase and asking for Cale Hartwich, the notary. Cale met him with a smile and a handshake and led him toward Hollis's room like they were going in to finalize a real estate closing instead of hovering over a dying man. I stood up. "I want to be in there too," I said. Cale said, "Of course, Uncle. Come on in. We just need your signature as the witness." I walked into my brother's room. Hollis was propped up slightly, eyes glassy but open. The notary had already laid a stack of papers on one of those folding hospital trays over the bed, and was speaking in the flat, practiced voice of a man who signs people through things all day long. I said, "Can I see the documents first?" He handed me the top sheet. The first document was what Cale had described. A quick claim deed transferring the Coeur d'Alene property to Cale Hartwich. Then I looked at the second. Power of attorney. Immediate effect. Sole agent over all of Hollis's financial affairs. Then the third. Change of beneficiary on a union life insurance policy. $400,000. Cale's name newly typed in, replacing what looked like Bry's on the underlying carbon copy. The room got very quiet. I looked at Cale and said, "What are these other two?" He answered too fast. "Just protective measures in case Dad's condition changes, and somebody needs to handle things in the next few days." I said, "But you told me he's expected to pass in the next few days. So why does he need a power of attorney?" His jaw tightened. "Uncle, please. Now isn't the time." I held up the insurance document. "Why is the life insurance being changed?" He said, "Bry agreed to that." I said, "Did she?" He didn't answer. Not directly. The notary was looking back and forth between us now, like a man realizing he had walked into the wrong kind of room. I told him, "Could we have a few minutes alone?" He nodded and stepped out. I shut the door behind him. Then I turned to Cale and said very quietly, "Call your sister right now. Put her on speaker." He gave me a look that was half annoyance, half disbelief. "Uncle, you're exhausted. You've been here too long. Call her." He didn't move. So I took out my phone and called her myself. I hadn't spoken to Bry in years. Her number was still in my contacts. She answered on the second ring. I put her on speaker and said, "Bry, it's Uncle Owen. I'm at the hospice with your father and your brother and a notary. Did you agree to be removed as beneficiary from your father's life insurance policy through the union?" Silence. Then she said, slow and stunned, "I'm sorry, Uncle Owen." "What?" I said. "Did you agree to it?" She said, "I don't know what you're talking about." "What life insurance policy?" Cale stepped in then, smooth and quick. BRY-I. "Listen, this is just a misunderstanding. These documents are protective." She cut him off so sharply it startled even me. "Cale, what did you do?" He said. "Bry, calm down." She said, "Uncle Owen, don't sign anything. I'm booking a flight tonight. Please don't sign anything." I hung up. The oxygen concentrator clicked in the corner. Hollis was breathing hard but looking right at me. Cale said, "You don't understand the financial situation here. Dad owes money. He owes money to me. I've been paying for things for years. I deserve." I said, "Get out." He took one half step forward like he thought maybe he could still talk his way around me. I said it again. "Get out of this room." He looked at me, and I want to be careful how I say this because people hear a story like this and they want the villain to reveal himself in one clean moment. Life usually doesn't do that. But I can tell you the boy I taught to bait a hook when he was 7 was not in that face anymore. There was somebody else standing there. Somebody calculating. Somebody already moving on to the next angle. He gathered up his papers, picked up his briefcase, walked out without another word. I sat down on the edge of Hollis's bed and took his hand. He was crying without making a sound. Tears just running into the pillow. I said, "It's all right." I stopped it. He squeezed my hand once. He died 31 hours later, just before sunrise on Wednesday morning. Bry made it in time. She was there. I was there. Cale was not. The week after the funeral, Bry and I sat down in Coeur d'Alene with my brother's actual lawyer, a woman named Marjorie Kestrel who had handled Hollis's affairs for 20 years. She pulled the real will. The cabin was supposed to be sold and split 50-50 between Cale and Bry. The union life insurance was Bry's, all $400,000 of it. The savings, about $86,000, were to be divided 3 ways. with the last third going to a scholarship fund at the trade school where Hollis had done his apprenticeship back in 1972. Everything Cale had brought into that hospice room was built to flip those terms. If I'd signed, the cabin would have become his outright. The insurance would have become his. And with a live power of attorney and a dying father who could barely lift his head, he could have emptied the savings before the will was ever read. Marjorie sat back in her chair and looked at me over her glasses. You know what would have happened if you'd signed those papers? I said, I do now. She said, what made you question it? And I told her about the woman across the hall. The woman who listened through the wall. The woman who waited up at 2 in the morning for a man she barely knew and told him the one thing he didn't want to hear. That Saturday, I drove back down to Boise to thank her. I brought a little box of pastries from a bakery Bri recommended, and a card I'd written by hand. The nurse at the front desk recognized me as soon as I walked in, and her face changed when I told her who I was there to see. Mrs. Pebbly had died Thursday, 2 days earlier, quietly in her sleep. The nurse asked if we'd been close. I said, no ma'am, we only really spoke once. But she did something for me I don't know how to repay. The nurse stood there thinking for a second, then said, did she leave you a note? I said I didn't think so. She disappeared into the back and came out with an envelope. My name was on the front in shaky handwriting. Mr. Hartwich. The nurse said, she left this Wednesday morning. Told us if you came back to give it to you. If you didn't, throw it away. I took it outside and sat on a bench in the cold November air and opened it. Inside was one sheet of paper folded once. The writing was thin and slanted. It said, Mr. Hartwich, I don't know if you listened to me or not. I hope you did. My son's name was Tomlin. He took everything I had in the spring of 2009. The house, the savings, the rings my husband gave me. I never saw any of it again. He doesn't speak to me anymore because there's nothing left to take. The reason I'm telling you this is that I have spent 15 years lying in beds like this one, in apartments smaller than this room, in places I never imagined I would end up. And the worst part is not the losing. The worst part is that nobody warned me. Not one person. I had a sister-in-law who knew what Tomlin was. She told me afterward when I asked, that she had suspected for years. I asked her why she didn't say anything. She said it wasn't her place. That was the day I decided that if I ever again saw something happening to someone else, I would say something. It would be my place. So I said something to you. Whatever happened, I hope you are safe. Sincerely, Esther Pebbly. I sat there with that letter in my hands for I don't know how long. A nurse came out at one point and asked if I was all right, and I told her yes. I was all right. I was just sitting a little while. It wasn't her place. That's what saved us. That woman had every reason in the world to keep her mouth shut. She was dying. She was alone. She didn't know me anything. My brother wasn't her brother. My family wasn't her burden. She could have rolled over and let me walk right past her doorway. Instead, she spent some of the last clean strength she had on a stranger. That saved my brother's last wishes. That kept my niece from being cheated out of $500,000 by her own brother in the worst week of her life. That saved me from becoming the man who had signed away his own brother's estate, and then had to live with it. I drove back to Tucson that same night. 11 hours again. And all the way down I kept thinking about my own life. About how many things I had seen in other families over the years and looked away from because I told myself it wasn't my place. A friend whose grown daughter always seemed to need money with a different emergency every month. A neighbor whose son moved back in to help, then started helping himself to more than the bills. Little warning signs. Uneasy silences. Numbers that didn't add up. I had seen them. I had chosen not to see them. Cale called me twice over the next month. I didn't answer. He sent a long email full of misunderstandings and accusations. Said I'd humiliated him in front of a notary. Said I had broken the family. Said his father would have wanted peace. I read it once. Then I deleted it. Bri and I, on the other hand, started talking almost every Sunday. Funny how something can break and something else can begin in the same season. She came down to Tucson for Easter with her 2 kids. We went to the Desert Museum. We ate green chili cheeseburgers at a place Marlo and I used to love. Her oldest drew me a picture of a Roadrunner that's still on my refrigerator. About 6 months after Hollis died, I got a letter from a woman in Spokane I'd never heard of. Her name was Dolores. She said her father had died in May, and she'd been the executor of his estate. While going through his things, she found a notebook where he had written down names of people who had defrauded him. One of those names was Cale Hartwich. Apparently Cale had borrowed $47,000 from Dolores's father, who was in his 80s and never paid back a dime. She had tracked me down through Hollis's obituary because she wanted to know whether there was a way to file some kind of claim, and because she had reached the point a lot of people reach after somebody dies. The point where shame finally has to answer to paperwork. I called her back. We talked for an hour. She told me her father had been the kind of man who would never admit to his children that he'd been taken. Not because he didn't know. Because he was embarrassed. Because once a person admits that somebody got inside their trust and hollowed it out, they have to live with the look on everybody's face after that. I called Bri. Bri called Marjorie. Marjorie started digging. What came out over the next few months was uglier than either of us expected. Cale hadn't just tried to take advantage of his dying father. He'd been doing versions of the same thing for years. Not only to family, to clients, to his father's old friends, to elderly men who thought they were helping a nice, responsible younger man through a short, rough patch, to anybody who'd let him near a checkbook or a signature line. By the time Marjorie had the outline of it, Cale was sitting on roughly $300,000 in unsecured debt, 2 pending civil suits in Washington state, and a gambling problem nobody in the family had known about. The hospice scheme had been his last roll of the dice. That's what Marjorie told us. If he'd gotten the cabin, he could have leveraged it inside a week, outrun some of his creditors, maybe bought himself another 6 months of pretending his life wasn't collapsing. People like neat moral endings. They want one scene where everything is exposed and the guilty person confesses and everybody gets what they deserve by sundown. That's not what happened. He didn't go to trial for what he tried to do in that hospice room. Not exactly. That would have been difficult to prove in a criminal way. And Bri and I already had what mattered most. The documents had not been signed. Hollis's real will held. The estate was protected. But the rest of it, the Spokane victims, Dolores's father, 2 other elderly clients, a pattern of fraud and manipulation, that moved forward. 19 months after Hollis died, Cale went to trial. He got 6 years. He is still inside as I'm telling you this. Bri writes to him sometimes. I don't. There's a boy in this story too, though not in the way people think. Cale has a son, my great-nephew, named Brockton. He was 14 the last time I checked. Lives with his mother, Cale's ex-wife, up in Bellingham. Every year I send him a birthday card and a check at Christmas. His mother sends a thank you note back. I don't expect anything from that boy. I don't expect a relationship or gratitude, or some future phone call where he tells me he remembers every card. That isn't why I do it. I do it because I want one child in that line to grow up with proof that somebody on his father's side thought about him kindly. About a year after the trial, Bri and I started doing something small. Not a foundation. Not a nonprofit. Nothing fancy. Just a monthly talk through her church in Oregon and another through a senior center near me in Tucson. We go in, we tell our story, we tell Esther Pebbly's story with her daughter's permission, and then we sit down and listen. If you want to know how common something is in this country, sit quietly in a room and make it safe for people to tell the truth about it. I wish I could say what happened to my family was rare. It is not. I've heard my own story with the names changed at least 40 times in 2 years. A son who needs just one signature. A grandson helping with online banking. A daughter who already found the perfect person to clean up the trust. A nephew who says there's no time to review it because the notary is already on the way. It happens every day. In every state. To people who considered themselves careful. To people who balance their checkbooks every Sunday morning. I keep Esther's letter folded in the drawer of my nightstand. Sometimes I take it out and read it before bed. Sometimes I think about how easy it would have been for her not to speak. How easy for her to say, not my family, not my business, not my problem. How easy for me to dismiss her, which I almost did. The older I get, the less I believe decency is measured by how warmly you feel toward the people you are supposed to love. Anybody can do that. Real decency is harder. It's seeing clearly when seeing clearly hurts. It's asking one more question when everybody wants you to move along. It's slowing down when someone is rushing you. It's saying no with a notary standing 3 feet away. It's understanding that family and safe are not always the same word. I've thought a lot since that night in Boise about the kind of man I was before Esther stopped me in that hallway. I thought I was wise because I was skeptical with strangers and trusting with family. I thought that was balance. It wasn't. It was blindness in a respectable jacket. I had built my whole life on the idea that the people who shared my blood were the one group I wouldn't need to protect myself from. And the bill for that belief almost came due in the final 2 days of my brother's life. What I learned from Hollis lying in that bed unable to say what he needed to say, from Cale standing there with 3 documents stacked in the wrong order, from Esther sitting in the dark waiting for somebody to pass her open door, is that every choice sets something in motion. The things we refuse to notice set the loudest things in motion of all. Cale didn't become that man in a week. He became that man over years of nobody in the family asking him hard questions. Years of Hollis sending him money and calling it generosity. Years of me patting him on the shoulder at Christmas and not noticing how carefully he watched every room. Small avoidances dressed up as kindness. That's how a lot of disasters get their start. The opposite is true too. One woman, alone, dying with every reason to conserve what strength she had left, decided to spend a minute of it warning a stranger. One choice. One night. And that choice traveled farther than she ever knew. It protected an estate. It preserved a dying man's wishes. It saved a daughter from being robbed while packing funeral clothes. It spared me a guilt I would have carried to my own grave. The size of a thing has very little to do with how far it travels. So if there is something in your own life right now, some situation in your family, some document, some rushed explanation, some pressure that doesn't feel clean, some quiet little alarm bell you keep trying to talk yourself out of hearing, listen to it. If somebody is pushing you to sign today, right now, before the office closes, before the notary leaves, before your mother wakes up, before your father passes, slow down. Take the paper home. Take a picture of it. Call somebody who has nothing to gain. The people who love you will wait a day. The people who don't won't. That may be the truest sentence I learned out of all of this. I'm 63 years old. I lost my wife. I lost my brother. I came within a single tired signature of losing my brother's life's work too, because I wanted the boy I remembered to still be the man standing in front of me. He wasn't. Sometimes the people we love become people we do not recognize. And one of the hardest kindest things we can do for ourselves and for the people still depending on us is to look at what is actually in front of us instead of what we wish were there. When I go up to Idaho now to see Bri and the kids, I sometimes drive past the hospice in Boise. It's still there. Still smells faintly like lavender from the parking lot if the wind is right. Esther Pebble's room faced the road. I look up at that window every time I pass. I never really knew her. We spoke twice. She gave me one note. But she is family to me in a way some of my own blood never managed to be. That's another thing age has taught me. Family is not just who shares your name or your jawline or your old photographs. Family is who shows up. Family is who tells you the truth. Family is who is willing to make a moment uncomfortable in order to keep your whole life from being destroyed. If you have had somebody like that in your own life, you know what I mean. And if you haven't, then maybe the work in front of you is to become that person for somebody else. To speak when it would be easier not to. To warn when warning might not be welcomed. To say, as plainly as Esther said it to me in a dark hallway at 2 in the morning, don't sign it tonight. Drive home if you can. The truth will still be there in the morning. And so will the people who actually love you.